Hello, I'm the Economancer, a high priest of the Economicon. Previously in this vlog, we had went over Karl Marx, wage, labor, and capital. Then we were going to do Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. But I thought to myself, that seems unfair. It seems unequal that he would get 2 and then 3 essays where Adam Smith only got 1. So in the best interest of, maintaining good equality, I'm only going to do 1 of Karl Marx. So that means the next one's actually going to be Max Weber. So this one is going to be on class, status, and party. So we have to understand that Weber kind of wrote a critique of Karl Marx's and what his position is, a simplistic look at inequality. By the name, class, status, and party, these are the 3 things that Weber is pointing at as creating or being a part of inequality in society. So I'm going to start off with the very first quote. The structure of every legal order directly influences the distribution of power, economic or otherwise, within its respective community. This is true of all legal orders and not only to that of the state. So right here he's pointing at, we have economic inequality, we have institutional inequality, but there are other forms of inequality because inequality in society, or as in humans in general, is ubiquitous. This leads me to the next. Economically conditioned power is not, of course, identical with power as such. On the contrary, the emergence of economic power may be the consequence of power existing on other grounds. So he's saying, okay, I'm going to understand the idea that people are economically unequal. But is the economics, the allocation of the resources, dependent upon specifically the economic system? That may not be true. You may have inequalities that come from various different sources that may actually help with the economic allocation into unequal terms. Then he goes on to say, now classes, status groups, and parties are phenomena of the distribution of power within a community. So I stated earlier, he's making this thesis that it's not just economic inequality. There are other types of inequality, and they may have feedback effects between each other. And this is something that he thought that Karl Marx, as well as other individuals at this time, had missed on what is inequality. The mode of distribution, in accordance with the law of marginal utility, excludes the non-wealthy from competing for highly valued goods. It favors the owners and, in fact, gives them a monopoly to acquire such goods. So now he's looking at it and he's saying, okay, there is some utility in Karl Marx's argument. There is reason to believe that, economic inequality does tend to continuously have this larger and larger feedback effect. But is that the entire way to look at it? The mode of distribution gives to the propertied a monopoly on the possibility of transferring property from the sphere of use as wealth to the sphere of capital. That is, it gives them the entrepreneurial function and all chances to share directly or indirectly in the returns on capital. So, we have a capitalist class, and the transfer of wealth throughout these classes isn't stagnant. We can say that there is movement within these classes. You could have individuals between the difference between old money and new money. This building of wealth can be created. It doesn't have to just fall on the old vestiges of the serf that Karl Marx wanted to point out. Now, we have to understand that he's pointing to the quantitative and qualitative differences between people. He's pointing at slaves. He's pointing at the disposition over mobile instruments of production or capital goods of all sorts. Especially money and objects can be easily exchanged for it. Disposition over products of one's own labor or others' labor differing according to their various distances from consumability. And this kind of creates the idea of monopolies that he's going to build onto. Now, this isn't entirely untrue. We see this in regional economics. We see that when we have what we call a growth pole, this is where the center is actually going to, branch out. So we're going to have this unequal distribution spatially that's going to be having forward and backward linkages that's going to allow growth to happen overall, but it's going to start at one center. That's why we have metropolitan areas. That's why we have large cities, because people tend to agglomerate in one spot. So this is something well ahead of its time that Weber is pointing out. Now, I do want to point out when he talks about the bourgeoisie and all of that, he wants to make a distinction between people who own pure capital, like the production and manufacturer. This is what he says. The creditor-debtor relation becomes the basis of class situation, first in the cities where a credit market, however primitive, with rates of interest increasing according to the extent of dearth and factual monopolization of lending in the hands of a plutocracy, could develop. Therewith, class struggles begin. So he's saying, okay, we're getting mad at the renter, the owner of these businesses, but really who we should be mad at in these class struggles is those who own banking, those who kind of quantify this creditor-debtor relationship. And that's a big issue that comes up later as we look into more distinct forms of inequality. Now status groups hinder the strict carrying through the sheer market principle. In the present context, they are of interest only from this one point of view. So he's talking about status groups now. Status groups don't necessarily apply very often to economic groups, right? So the class that me and you may share is lower middle class, upper middle class, high class, etc. Those are classes. But your social status is not entirely defined by your economic class. Your social status can be within group, and it can be how you're perceived on that within group to an out group, and that may give you more leverage over other out groups. So you can have the bottom of this hierarchy in this social status group. He is not going to be viewed highly in other groups. Whereas if you're the top of your social status group, you're going to be more favorably looked at as the top of your social status group. And this has spillover effects in how you interact with everybody else. Today, the central issue is the determination of the price of labor. The transition is represented by the fight for access to the market and for the determination for the price of products. Now, this is important because we're looking at it now that we're getting away from, okay, it's purely about the capitalist and the proletariat. We're moving into other forms of how this inequality is building within the system. It's not such a simplistic look of just the owner and the bottom. We are now building a more larger scale. This is so in spite of the fact that it is precisely the cash boxes of the rentier, the shareholder, and the banker into which the more or less unearned gains flow rather than into the pockets of the manufacturers or of the business executives. So again, this goes back. He's reiterating, we can't continuously blame the manufacturer, the owner of machinery, the guy who's trying to produce more. Because that guy's trying to do the best that he can. When we're really looking at it, we're looking at those who own land, those who run the banks. This has become just as important in our modern lexicon for inequality as it has for any others. We've got kind of the restrictionist view of how we see inequality in modern day. And then we have like the Reformationists, something like Thomas Piketty, where they're like, okay, so we can't say that it's all bad, but this inequality is causing some problems. Now, we really get to this idea that he kind of points to America, and this is something that Brits say about America often, is that essentially America is a classless society. Now, a lot of people may disagree, but this is something that more class and caste-based systems tend to believe, that America doesn't have as much of a function of class. And he goes on to say that even the rich are expected to treat others equal in many social settings. And he contrasts this with like the US and German like card clubs. Whereas in Germany, you don't expect the rich businessman to also play cards with with the worker. But in the US, it's not often to see, the CEO of a business. Granted, this is a bit of a time ago, but even now, you wouldn't expect any different interaction between the CEO of a business in your local community at the bar with you. In fact, there may be a little bit of a difference in respectability, but for the most part, you would both be treated equally, as well as the institution and the other patronages would also treat you most likely equally. Now, there are some corruption that happens in some of these instances, with law enforcement and the institutions, but as a general rule, we don't expect that to happen. And then he points out, this equality of social esteem, right? So in America, we have like this peculiar way of showing the gentleman class that for the time period wasn't as obvious, right? So that was how individuals dressed. Little known fact, back in the day, towards the end of the Depression, many individuals refused to wear jeans. They actually called jeans depression pants. So if you wanted to set yourself apart from others when you went to look for a job, which is why it's so important in American society, you put on a suit. That made you look more respectable. That made you a gentleman. And that created other social status hierarchies that led to differences in the outcomes. And so when we're looking at this, America kind of created this gentleman class system, and it's kind of carried on today that a lot of people don't even realize why it's there. But that's why it was there. Because if you wanted to get a job, you did not want to wear depression pants so that you were a gentleman. Next, Weber talks about, castes in society, and he points out every society has castes. This is just a part of it. Other societies, such as you could say India, take the caste system to a much greater degree. But even in the United States, based on what I just said with a gentleman class, we've created a caste system. A lot of our derogatory terms that we have for individuals, wasn't necessarily founded upon, racial epithets. A lot of it was founded upon, class epithets or social status epithets. And he also points out, and even at this time, that all of these states and all of these societies, there's a caste system, but the extremities of them were based on the underlying differences to be held that are ethnic and racial. But it wasn't all of them were this. It was that there were some that were specific to this, and those tended to be the worst. But as a general rule, it was still something within the society. Then, Weber associates some subjective sentiment with race, but not all. And that is not the selection mechanism. Like, let me give you an example what I mean by a selection mechanism for social status, as well as, party. Knighthood, right? So knighthood selects those fit for warfare, which carries that through status and possibly physical stature. So we could actually see that status may have some physical bearing, but that physical bearing may manifest itself in these feedback loops, right? So, we have the idea that we've bred certain parts of society, such as like the Scandinavians, they've bred in such large capacity to be such big humans because they've selected that through their mate selection structure. And that's kind of led to the society that they have now of very large individuals. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that this is deterministic in any instance. What I'm saying is that we can understand why certain types of inequalities are selective, right? Because we have to understand, even at the most base level, individuals do not look the same. And so there's going to be a selection mechanism within that may quantify some of the unequal outcomes that happen. So we can look at it from the class, we can look at it from your status and position, and we can look at it from your party, because you're going to align yourself. And that could be political party. Very rarely Especially nowadays, do we find a whole lot of cross-party pollination. And I mean that figuratively and literally. Now, this is still only like a small part of the individual selection. And when we look at group selection, that's when we get to parties. And that's mostly, or can be, conditioned on economics, right? So if you're left leaning or right leaning, you're going to condition a lot of your positions on the how you feel economic allocation ought to be done. Now, there's a lot more that goes into this, but this is the central tenet behind what Weber was trying to get in this essay. Now, we've already kind of went over it, but the Weber critique of Marx is essentially that class is not the only level of social stratification. There are plenty others. And because Weber noticed that Marx failed to recognize these differences, he thought that communism would also carry these differences. So even if you manage to even out the economic inequalities, they would just turn up again because you have all of the other social inequalities in society. Now, and as an aside, it very well may be true that the other inequalities may actually maximize under, communism. And we've kind of seen that to some extent in, socialist or communist Russia and communist China, or any of the other communist countries where we've seen actual like political, aka party inequality actually grow. So once you flatten the economic, you very well may maximize the other two. And it may not just be that one, it could be the social status. So social status may, maximize. If you think about indigenous peoples, they're more economically equal, but they're less status equal. You're going to have shamans and druids and economancers like myself. Now, we can kind of think of this as like an early precursor to current affairs on, shared status for like gender and ethnic inequality. So a lot of the work that's been done later kind of took his framework, his general framework of inequality, and expanded it greatly. And that's kind of led us to where we are now in looking at all different types of inequality and understanding the intersection of all of these different types of inequalities. Now, just to be fair to the Marxists, they do have a decent critique of this. What they say is that you can point to these other types of inequalities, but even Weber himself noticed that a lot of them are conditioned on economic inequality. So, if you have differences on, outcomes and intelligence, that can be conditioned on the unequal economic performance, whether that's by group or by individual. You can look at, women in the workplace making 77 cents to $1, whether you believe that or not, whether it's just a trope. The Marxists would say that inequality is founded upon the economic inequality that's already happening. So to motivate that structure doesn't actually solve the overall problem. So you're just dividing rather than conquering. Now, my criticism of this is fairly simple. First, as with the current iterations of inequality and intersectionalism, is that it runs the risk of infinite regression, which ultimately leads to individualism, which should be the overall goal, but doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And that focusing on characteristics that are mostly malleable, you fail to address the institutional issues, right? So if you don't believe this, let me think of it this way. When you are trying to maximize your utility, when you're trying to do something as a choice, right? Your choice isn't just predicated on just you. It's predicated on society, it's predicated on economic calculations, but it's also predicated on what the institution has and wants from you. So if you're going to do something, you definitely make sure in your own calculations that how does the institution feel about what I'm going to do? So if we ignore the institution in all of this, then we're not getting anywhere. we're just going to be pointing our fingers at things that aren't important from the institutionalist framework. Now, speaking of the institutionalist framework, we will get into Veblen next time. And Veblen is the father of institutionalism, which is a major portion of modern economics, especially in economic and growth and development. Like, share, subscribe, do the thing, click the button, saying that.